The abandoned office on the top floor of the old Rosedale building had always felt like a relic of another era. To Harold, a 67-year-old janitor who had worked in the building for nearly 4 decades, it was just another floor to clean, though its emptiness carried a strange, almost melancholic weight. Harold was a man of routine, accustomed to the solitude of his work. With a weathered mop in one hand and a toolbox in the other, he had seen the building's many tenants come and go, their stories leaving faint traces behind in the cracks of the plaster and the scuffed hardwood floors. But this particular day, a chilly Thursday in early spring, was different. Harold had been tasked with clearing out the remnants of the top floor, which had been left untouched since the law firm that once occupied it abruptly closed years ago. The space was slated for demolition, and Harold, ever diligent, took pride in ensuring it would be left spotless before the wrecking crew arrived. The room was a time capsule of the late 1980s, filled with outdated furniture, yellowing papers, and file cabinets whose locks had long since rusted. As Harold moved a heavy cabinet to sweep behind it, he noticed something odd, a leather briefcase hidden in the narrow gap between the cabinet and the wall. It was caked in dust, its once polished surface now cracked and worn with age. For a moment, Harold hesitated. He had stumbled upon strange things before. Old letters, forgotten trinkets, even a stash of unopened liquor bottles. But there was something different about this briefcase. Its placement felt deliberate, as though someone had hidden it there with purpose. He bent down, groaning as his knees protested, and pulled the case out, brushing away the thick layer of grime. The air seemed to shift around him, growing heavier with an unspoken significance. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he undid the tarnished latches, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. When the lid finally creaked open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, neatly stacked bundles of cash filled the briefcase to the brim, each bound tightly with faded currency bands. It was a fortune, more money than Harold had ever seen in his entire life. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Harold stared, his mind racing with disbelief and an almost primal urge to shut the case and walk out of the building with it. But as his initial shock began to ebb, his gaze shifted to the scattered papers tucked between the bundles of cash. They were crumpled and yellowed, some handwritten and others typed, their edges frayed with time. Harold picked up the top sheet, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the contents. The document mentioned a familiar name, one tied to the law firm that had once operated here, a firm notorious for its sudden closure amid rumors of scandal and corruption. The words embezzlement and missing funds leaped off the page, sending a chill down Harold's spine. As he sifted through the papers, other names and cryptic notes emerged, painting a picture of something dark and deeply unsettling. The money wasn't just cash. It was evidence, a piece of a puzzle that no one had solved. Harold leaned back, the briefcase still open in front of him, and rubbed his temples. He thought of Margaret, his wife of 45 years, who was battling a chronic illness that had drained their savings and left them in debt. The temptation to take the money was overwhelming. It could pay for Margaret's treatments, give them the financial freedom they had never known, and allow Harold to retire with dignity. Yet, as he stared at the bills, another thought crept in. What if someone was looking for this briefcase? What if it was tied to the scandal that had destroyed lives and reputations decades ago? The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the abandoned office. Harold stood frozen, the briefcase still in his hands, as 1,000 questions flooded his mind. Who had hidden the money? Why had it been left here for so long? And most importantly, what should he do now? Harold didn't know it yet, but the discovery of that briefcase was about to change his life forever, pulling him into a story of greed, corruption, and moral choices that would test the very core of who he was. For the first time in years, Harold felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him, and he realized that this was no ordinary day at work. Harold sat at his modest kitchen table late that night, the briefcase resting heavily on the worn wood surface, as if its weight extended beyond the physical. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Margaret had already gone to bed, exhausted from another day of managing her illness. Harold hadn't told her about the briefcase, not yet. He had spent hours pacing the tiny living room, his mind running circles around the same question. What should he do? On one hand, the money was right there, a tantalizing solution to problems that had plagued him and Margaret for years. On the other, the papers inside the briefcase whispered of a past too sinister to ignore. The temptation was nearly unbearable. Harold's life had been a series of sacrifices, each one stacking atop the other like the bricks of the very building he had maintained for decades. He had worked tirelessly, often taking double shifts to cover unexpected bills. Vacations were a luxury he and Margaret had long abandoned. Retirement, once a distant dream, now felt like an impossibility. And then there was Margaret's health. Her mounting medical expenses had reduced their savings to dust, and each new bill felt like another nail in the coffin of their hopes for a peaceful life. Harold ran a hand through his thinning hair, his fingers trembling as he glanced at the briefcase. In it lay a lifeline, a way to save the woman he loved and finally escape the crushing weight of their financial burdens. But the other half of his mind wouldn't stay quiet. The papers, now spread out across the table, painted a murky picture. They mentioned names, powerful names, of individuals who had once held sway over the city's politics and finances. There were contracts and memos, some half-burned, others hastily scrawled in panic handwriting. Phrases like offshore accounts and missing person report jumped out at Harold like accusations, their meaning both clear and obscured by time. Harold couldn't shake the feeling that the money wasn't just forgotten wealth. It was tainted, tied to something much larger and darker than he could comprehend. He thought back to his father, a stern man who had instilled in Harold a strict sense of right and wrong. "Your integrity is the only thing no one can take from you," his father used to say, his deep voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. But Harold wondered if his father had ever faced a situation like this, a chance to trade integrity for salvation. What would Margaret think? She had always been the moral compass in their marriage, the one who volunteered at the community center and baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. Would she see the money as a blessing or a curse? The clock ticked loudly, each second amplifying the silence of the house. Harold's gaze drifted to a faded photograph on the wall, him and Margaret on their wedding day, young and full of hope. He had promised to provide for her, to protect her, and now he had a chance to make good on that promise in a way he never imagined. But at what cost? Harold felt the sharp edge of guilt cutting into his thoughts. If the money was stolen or connected to a crime, could he live with himself for using it? Would it taint the very love he was trying to save? Harold sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his dilemma. He picked up one of the documents, a typewritten memo with the name of a high-profile lawyer he remembered from the news decades ago. The man had been at the center of a scandal involving fraud and embezzlement, though the details had faded from Harold's memory. The scandal had ended careers and shattered lives, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that the money in the briefcase was a remnant of that chaos. Yet, as he stared at the cash, another thought entered his mind. What if he kept just a little? Enough to cover Margaret's next round of treatments? Would anyone notice? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and began pacing again. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to rationalize every angle. What if the money had been forgotten, left behind by people who no longer cared about it? Or what if it was evidence, and keeping it would make him an accomplice to whatever crime it was tied to? Harold's heart pounded as he realized the enormity of his predicament. This wasn't just about money. It was about who he was and the kind of man he wanted to be. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the kitchen window, Harold made a decision, not a final one, but a step. He would take the briefcase back to the building and look for more clues, anything that could help him understand where the money had come from and what it meant. He couldn't tell Margaret yet, not until he was sure. For now, the briefcase would remain his secret, a Pandora's box that had already begun to unravel the quiet, uneventful life he had built. Harold didn't know it yet, but the choice he was wrestling with would set him on a path far more dangerous and far more transformative than he could ever imagine. Harold returned to the Rosedale building the next morning, the briefcase tucked carefully inside a battered gym bag he dusted off from the back of his closet. His steps echoed through the nearly empty halls as he climbed the stairs to the top floor. The air was colder here, carrying the faint smell of mildew and decay, as though the abandoned space itself held its breath in anticipation of his return. Harold had spent decades cleaning these floors, mopping up the grime of others' lives, but now every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the dusty light fixtures, felt heavy with hidden meaning. He set the bag down on the same spot where he'd found the briefcase, his hands trembling slightly as he unzipped it. Pulling the briefcase out, he opened it once again, the sight of the cash just as surreal as it had been the first time. Yet this time, his focus wasn't on the money. It was on the papers, the scattered puzzle pieces he hoped would lead him to some kind of clarity. Harold spread them across the floor, crouching uncomfortably on his aging knees, and began to read each one more carefully. The first document was a memo on official law firm letterhead, dated over 20 years ago. It mentioned a name Harold recognized immediately, Richard Sterling, a prominent attorney who had once been the shining star of the firm that occupied this building. Sterling's face had been plastered across newspapers during the early 2000s, tied to allegations of embezzlement and financial misconduct that had brought the firm crashing down. Harold remembered the scandal vaguely, how the firm's clients, including small business owners and retirees, had lost everything in what was described as one of the most elaborate financial frauds in the city's history. But what stood out most vividly in Harold's memory was the mysterious disappearance of one of Sterling's junior associates, a young woman named Claire Mallory, who had reportedly been preparing to testify against him before she vanished without a trace. Harold's fingers brushed against a handwritten note tucked beneath the memo. It was scrawled hastily, as though written in a moment of desperation. The ink had bled slightly, the words smudged but still legible. They know. I have to hide this. Don't trust anyone. No signature, no date, but Harold's chest tightened as he imagined the fear behind those words. He couldn't shake the feeling that the note had been written by Claire herself. Piece by piece, Harold examined the rest of the papers. There were ledger sheets with strange, uneven numbers that didn't add up, and a photocopied list of names, some of which had been crossed out with thick black ink. One name at the bottom of the list was circled, Claire Mallory. Harold's eyes lingered on it, his stomach churning as the implications began to sink in. This wasn't just a stash of stolen money. It was evidence, a breadcrumb trail left behind by someone who had likely paid the ultimate price for their courage. The last document Harold unfolded was a faded photograph. It showed a group of people standing in front of the Rosedale building, smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. Harold recognized Richard Sterling immediately, his sharp suit and smug expression making him stand out from the rest. To Sterling's right stood a young woman with a kind smile, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Harold didn't need the caption on the back to know her name, Claire Mallory. But it was the man on the far left that made Harold's heart skip a beat. Though much younger in the photo, Harold recognized him instantly. It was Peter Caldwell, the building's current owner and the man who had hired Harold all those years ago. The realization hit Harold like a freight train. Peter had always been polite but distant, treating Harold with a kind of detached respect reserved for those who blend into the background. But now Harold couldn't shake the feeling that Peter was more than just a landlord. If Peter had been connected to the firm during its heyday, what did he know about the money? About Claire? Harold gathered the papers, his mind a whirlwind of questions and half-formed theories. Why had Peter kept this floor untouched for so long? Why had he never mentioned his connection to the firm? And most pressing of all, did Peter know about the briefcase? Harold's palms grew sweaty at the thought. If Peter was involved in what happened all those years ago, then Harold might not be the only one aware of the briefcase's existence. He glanced around the dimly lit room, the shadows suddenly feeling oppressive, as though they were hiding unseen eyes. His heart pounding, Harold realized he couldn't keep this to himself forever. The papers were too damning, the money too dangerous. But who could he trust? The police? The media? Every option felt like a gamble, and Harold wasn't sure he could afford to make the wrong choice. He needed more information, something concrete to tie everything together. But one thing was certain, the briefcase wasn't just a forgotten relic of the past. It was a time bomb, and Harold was standing at its center. As Harold packed up the briefcase and headed for the stairs, a sense of foreboding settled over him. He knew he was stepping into something far bigger than himself, something that could either bring justice or destroy everything he held dear. For the first time in his life, Harold felt like more than a janitor, more than a man living paycheck to paycheck. He felt like a man with a purpose, though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty and danger. Harold spent the next few days walking a razor's edge between caution and obsession. The briefcase, now hidden under a loose floorboard in his modest home, seemed to radiate a magnetic pull that Harold couldn't resist. Every spare moment, every sleepless hour in the dead of night, was consumed by the mystery surrounding its contents. He knew he couldn't make sense of it all on his own, but he also knew that trusting the wrong person could unravel everything. With Margaret's condition worsening and the weight of the money pressing down on him, Harold resolved to uncover the truth behind the briefcase himself. His first step was the library, a place Harold hadn't visited in years, but one that still carried the faint scent of old books and inked pages. Sitting at a dusty microfilm reader, Harold scrolled through archived newspapers, the fluorescent light casting sharp shadows on his weathered face. He searched for articles about the Rosedale building, the law firm, and Richard Sterling. The scandal, it seemed, had been even more explosive than Harold remembered. Headlines like Sterling Law Firm implodes amid fraud allegations and Claire Mallory, the missing whistleblower, leapt off the screen, each one painting a grim picture of greed, betrayal, and unresolved questions. Harold read with a mounting sense of dread. According to the articles, Claire had been poised to expose Richard Sterling and the firm for laundering millions of dollars through offshore accounts. She had been gathering evidence for months, working closely with investigative journalists. But just weeks before she was set to testify, she vanished. The official story suggested she had fled the country, possibly out of fear or coercion, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that her disappearance was far more sinister. The reporters hinted at her having left behind critical evidence that could bring Sterling and his accomplices to justice, but no one had ever found it. Harold couldn't help but wonder if the briefcase in his possession was the very thing Claire had risked her life to hide. As Harold pieced together the fragments of the story, he began to notice connections that sent chills down his spine. Many of the names tied to the scandal, lawyers, executives, and even local politicians, had mysteriously disappeared from the public eye after the firm's collapse. Some had retired abruptly, while others had relocated to distant cities, their reputations in tatters. But one name stood out among the rest: Peter Caldwell. Though his involvement in the firm's operations had been downplayed at the time, Harold couldn't ignore the photo he'd found in the briefcase. Peter had been more than a peripheral figure. He had been right there in the thick of it, standing beside Sterling and Claire. What was his role in the scandal? And more importantly, why had he stayed so close to the building all these years, quietly overseeing its operations? Determined to find answers, Harold began observing Peter more closely during his daily shifts. He noticed details he had overlooked before. Peter's habit of arriving late in the evenings, his frequent closed-door meetings with unfamiliar visitors, and the way he seemed to avoid the top floor entirely. Harold's suspicions deepened when he overheard Peter on a tense phone call one night. Standing just out of sight, Harold caught fragments of the conversation. "The floor's being cleared next week." "No, I told you it's handled." The words sent a jolt through Harold. Was Peter trying to destroy evidence before anyone could find it? Did he know about the briefcase? Harold's next move was risky, but he felt he had no choice. Under the guise of needing additional cleaning supplies, he ventured into Peter's office during his lunch break. The room was immaculate, almost sterile, but Harold's practiced eye caught small details. A locked filing cabinet, a stack of folders labeled archive, and a faint indentation on the carpet where a safe might have been. Harold's hands itched to dig deeper, but he knew he couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. Instead, he committed everything to memory, vowing to return when the timing was right. That evening, Harold decided to expand his search beyond the building. He tracked down former employees of the firm, pretending to be an old acquaintance curious about their time there. Most were hesitant to talk, their responses curt and guarded. But one former paralegal, an older woman named Ruth, was more forthcoming. Over coffee in a quiet diner, Ruth recounted how the firm had been a pressure cooker of ambition and corruption. She described Claire as a bright, determined young woman who had been too honest for her own good. When Harold mentioned Peter Caldwell, Ruth's expression darkened. "Peter was always Sterling's shadow," she said. "He never made a move without Richard's say-so. If he's still around, it's because he knows where the bodies are buried, maybe even literally." The conversation left Harold shaken but resolute. He was uncovering pieces of a puzzle that others had either ignored or been too afraid to complete. But with every step closer to the truth, the danger grew. Harold began to notice unfamiliar cars parked near his home, their occupants lingering just long enough to make him uneasy. Phone calls to his landline came more frequently, always ending in silence when he answered. Someone, it seemed, was watching. As Harold sat in his living room that night, staring at the briefcase hidden beneath the floorboards, he felt the enormity of what he was up against. The money could change his life, but the truth it represented could change the lives of countless others. Harold knew he had a choice to make: retreat into the safety of ignorance or push forward into the unknown, risking everything for a justice that had been denied for too long. With a deep breath, Harold made his decision. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a man with a mission, and he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the whole story. Harold's decision to uncover the truth brought an unwelcome shift to his life, one that felt heavier and darker with each passing day. The clues he'd pieced together were beginning to form a coherent, damning picture, but the closer he got to clarity, the more perilous his position became. He noticed it in the little things at first, the subtle but undeniable ways his routine was disrupted. The lock on his supply closet at the Rosedale building, which had always been sturdy, was suddenly broken one morning, its contents rifled through. A man in a sharp suit loitered in the lobby for hours without explanation, his piercing eyes following Harold's every move. Even his walk home from work, a quiet, predictable route he'd taken for decades, began to feel like a gauntlet, every shadow carrying the weight of a potential threat. The first outright warning came late one night. Harold had just returned home, his tired feet dragging as he climbed the porch steps. The briefcase, still hidden beneath the loose floorboard, had been gnawing at his thoughts all evening. He had resolved to examine the papers again to see if there was something he had missed, when he noticed an envelope taped to his front door. The paper was thick, the handwriting precise, and the message inside was chilling in its simplicity. "Stop digging, Harold. For your own good." No signature, no clue as to who had written it, but Harold didn't need a name to understand the gravity of the message. Harold's instinct was to turn to the police, but the thought of doing so felt futile. The scandal surrounding the Sterling firm had implicated people at every level of power, and Harold had no way of knowing who could be trusted. He thought of the articles he'd read, the names he'd seen in the briefcase, and the cryptic conversations he'd overheard. It was clear that the people involved in this were not the kind to play fair. They had the resources, the connections, and the ruthlessness to make people disappear. The tension reached a breaking point when Harold noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street from his house. It was sleek, black, and idled too long to be anything but deliberate. Harold tried to tell himself it was a coincidence, but when he left for work the next morning, the same car followed him for 3 blocks before turning off abruptly. At the Rosedale building, his discomfort grew. Peter Caldwell, who had always been distant but polite, now seemed to regard Harold with a pointed suspicion. During their brief exchanges, Peter's eyes lingered a little too long, his tone a little too sharp. Harold began to wonder if Peter knew more about the briefcase than he let on, and if so, what he might do to protect that knowledge. The danger became undeniable one evening when Harold returned to the top floor to search for additional clues. The floor, once silent and untouched, now bore signs of recent activity. Papers that Harold had carefully arranged were scattered, drawers were left ajar, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Someone else had been there, and they hadn't been careful. Harold's heart pounded as he backed away, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But as he turned toward the stairs, he froze. Footsteps echoed from below, slow and deliberate, drawing closer with each second. Harold pressed himself against the wall, his breathing shallow, as the footsteps grew louder. He thought of the briefcase still hidden at home and the secrets it held. If the people following him were after it, they wouldn't stop until they had it, and Harold wasn't sure they would leave him alive once they did. The footsteps stopped just as abruptly as they had started, and the silence that followed was almost worse. Harold waited, his fists clenched, until he was certain the intruder had left. When he finally descended the stairs, his legs felt like jelly, and every sound seemed amplified, each creak of the old building a potential threat. That night, Harold sat in his kitchen, the briefcase open in front of him once again. He examined the contents with fresh eyes, looking for anything he might have overlooked. The more he read, the more he realized how deep the corruption went. The papers implicated not only Richard Sterling but also prominent local politicians, law enforcement officials, and even journalists who had been paid to bury the truth. It was no wonder that Claire Mallory had vanished. She had been fighting a machine far larger and more dangerous than herself. Harold couldn't help but wonder if he was next. Margaret's frail voice broke his train of thought as she shuffled into the kitchen, her robe wrapped tightly around her thin frame. "Harold," she said softly, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on? You've been so distant lately." Harold hesitated, the weight of his secret threatening to crush him. He wanted to tell her everything, to share the burden that had consumed him, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The less Margaret knew, the safer she would be. Instead, he forced a smile and guided her back to bed, his heart heavy with guilt. As Harold lay awake that night, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he knew he couldn't keep running forever. The people watching him wouldn't stop, and the briefcase wouldn't stay hidden for long. If he wanted to protect Margaret and himself, he needed to make a move. The question was, what? Harold's options were limited, each one fraught with risk. He could try to disappear, but that would mean leaving behind everything he had ever known. He could confront Peter, but that felt like walking into the lion's den. Or he could go public, exposing the truth and hoping it would be enough to keep him safe. The shadows seemed to grow darker as Harold weighed his options, his mind swirling with fear and uncertainty. He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. The briefcase had drawn him into a fight far bigger than himself, and there was no turning back now. Harold closed his eyes, willing himself to find strength in the face of the growing storm. He didn't know how, but he was determined to see this through, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The days blurred into a haze of paranoia and relentless determination. Harold, though tired and strained, pushed forward, his life a precarious balancing act between uncovering the truth and protecting himself. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still something missing, some thread that could tie everything together. Each step Harold took toward understanding the briefcase and its secrets brought him closer to an unshakable realization. Whatever this was, it went far beyond the Sterling firm scandal. It wasn't just about greed or corruption. This was about power, control, and the cost of standing up to it. One evening, after a long day of cleaning and avoiding Peter Caldwell's increasingly suspicious glances, Harold decided to take a bold risk. He returned to the library, this time searching for information about Claire Mallory's disappearance. He was certain she was the key to everything, the missing link that could explain why the briefcase had been hidden and why so many lives had been ruined to protect its contents. As Harold scrolled through decades-old articles, an unexpected lead caught his eye. An interview with Claire's sister, Lorraine Mallory, conducted shortly after Claire had vanished. Lorraine had been vocal in her belief that her sister hadn't run away, but had been silenced by powerful forces. Her words had been dismissed as conspiracy, but Harold's instincts told him otherwise. Finding Lorraine wasn't easy, but Harold's years of persistence paid off. After several dead ends and unreturned calls, he finally tracked her down to a small, unassuming home on the outskirts of the city. Lorraine, now in her 60s, opened the door cautiously, her sharp eyes scanning Harold with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. He introduced himself, explaining that he was a janitor at the Rosedale building and that he had found something that might bring closure to Claire's story. At the mention of her sister's name, Lorraine's demeanor softened, and she invited Harold inside. The house was modest but filled with warmth, its walls adorned with photographs of Claire. Lorraine spoke about her sister with a mixture of pride and sadness, describing her as a fearless advocate for justice who had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. She knew what she was up against, Lorraine said, her voice heavy with emotion. But she thought she could handle it. She thought the truth would protect her. When Harold pulled out the photograph from the briefcase, Lorraine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's her," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "And that's Richard Sterling." Her voice turned bitter as she pointed to the man on the far left. And him, Peter Caldwell. He was always lurking in the background, always watching. Claire told me he was Sterling's right-hand man, the one who handled the dirty work. If Peter's still involved, then this isn't over. Encouraged by Lorraine's insight, Harold showed her the rest of the documents from Briefcase. Lorraine examined them carefully, her face growing pale as she read the handwritten note Harold suspected had been written by Claire. This is her writing," Lorraine confirmed, her voice trembling. She must have known they were onto her. She must have hidden this briefcase, hoping someone would find it. Harold asked Lorraine if Claire had ever mentioned where she kept her evidence. Lorraine shook her head but paused, as if trying to remember something buried deep in her memory. "Wait," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing in thought. She used to talk about the top floor of the Rosedale building. She said it was the safest place because no one ever went up there. But she also mentioned something else, something about the ventilation system. She said it was like a maze, full of nooks and crannies where things could be hidden. The realization struck Harold like lightning. He had spent years cleaning the building, including its labyrinthine air ducts, but he had never thought to look there. If Claire had hidden more evidence, it was possible it was still there, waiting to be found. Harold thanked Lorraine for her help, promising to keep her updated on what he uncovered. As he left, Lorraine grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. "Be careful," she said. "They'll do anything to keep this buried." Back at the Rosedale building, Harold wasted no time. He climbed to the top floor under the cover of night, armed with a flashlight and a determination he hadn't felt in years. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every creak and whisper. Harold located a large vent near the corner of the room, its screws rusted from years of neglect. With trembling hands, he pried it open and shone his flashlight into the darkness. At first, the duct seemed empty, a narrow tunnel of dust and shadows. But as Harold crawled deeper, his flashlight caught a glint of something metallic. His heart raced as he reached for it, pulling out a small, locked box covered in grime. The lock had rusted, but Harold managed to pry it open with a screwdriver he'd brought with him. Inside were more documents, a tape recorder, and a stack of photographs, each one more damning than the last. The photos showed Richard Sterling, Peter Caldwell, and several other powerful figures engaging in what could only be described as incriminating activities. The tape recorder, though old, still worked, and its contents sent chills down Harold's spine. A recording of Claire Mallory's voice, detailing the firm's corruption and naming the people involved. As Harold sat there in the dusty vent, the weight of what he had uncovered pressed down on him. This was it, the evidence Claire had risked her life to protect. It was the key to unraveling the conspiracy, but it also made Harold a target. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. The truth was too big, too important to stay hidden. But as Harold crawled out of the vent, clutching the box tightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The building seemed to hum with a quiet menace, as if it too held its breath in anticipation of what would come next. Harold sat at his kitchen table that night, the contents of the small box spread out before him. The weight of the decision he was about to make felt like a physical presence, pressing down on his chest. He stared at the photographs, the documents, and the tape recorder, each item an undeniable piece of evidence that could shatter the lives of the powerful individuals they implicated. Yet, as clear as the stakes were, Harold found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of his choices. The world he had unearthed was one he was never meant to see, and now he stood at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take. Margaret shuffled into the kitchen, her fragile frame wrapped in a blanket. She noticed the papers on the table and frowned. "Harold," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern, "what's all this? You've been so distracted lately. Are you in some kind of trouble?" Harold's instinct was to brush her off, to shield her from the truth, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She deserved to know, and he was tired of carrying the burden alone. With a deep breath, Harold began to explain everything: the briefcase, the evidence, and the danger they were now in. Margaret listened in silence, her expression shifting from shock to worry to something Harold couldn't quite place. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her frail hands gripping the edges of the blanket. "Harold," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes, "you've stumbled onto something bigger than us. But you've also been given a chance to do something good, something that could help so many people. The question is, are you willing to risk everything to do it?" Her words echoed in Harold's mind long after she had gone back to bed. He thought about the people who had suffered because of the Sterling firm's greed, the retirees who had lost their life savings, the small business owners driven to bankruptcy, and Claire Mallory, who had likely paid the ultimate price for her courage. But Harold also thought about Margaret, about the life they had built together and the years they had left. If he exposed the truth, there was no guarantee they would be safe. The people behind the scandal had proven they were willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets, and Harold had no doubt they would come after him and Margaret if they felt threatened. The next morning, Harold made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He needed an ally, someone he could trust to help him navigate the minefield he had stumbled into. His mind went to Lorraine Mallory. She had already lost her sister to this fight, and Harold suspected she would be willing to help him see it through. He called her that afternoon, arranging to meet at her home to discuss the next steps. When Harold arrived, Lorraine greeted him with a mixture of relief and determination. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him as they sat down in her cozy living room. If Claire's evidence is still intact, we have to get it to someone who can use it. Someone who can make it impossible for these people to cover it up again. Harold nodded, though the question of who that someone might be still lingered in his mind. The police? The media? Both options felt risky, but Harold knew they couldn't afford to wait much longer. Lorraine suggested reaching out to a journalist Claire had worked with before her disappearance, a man named Jack Reynolds who had been one of the few reporters willing to take on the Sterling firm at the height of its power. Harold was hesitant at first, unsure if Jack could still be trusted, but Lorraine assured him that Jack had been a close friend of Claire's and had never stopped looking for answers about what happened to her. The plan was set. Harold and Lorraine would contact Jack and arrange to hand over the evidence, hoping he could use his platform to bring the story to light. But as they finalized the details, Harold's unease grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every step they took was being tracked by the people they were trying to expose. His fears were confirmed that night when he returned home to find the front door ajar. Harold froze, his heart pounding as he stepped inside. The living room was in disarray, the cushions on the couch slashed open, and the contents of the drawers scattered across the floor. He rushed to the kitchen, his stomach dropping when he saw the loose floorboard pried open. The briefcase was gone. Panic set in as Harold realized the gravity of what had happened. Someone knew. Someone had found the briefcase and taken it, likely erasing the only physical evidence Harold had of the conspiracy. But then his mind shifted to the box he had found in the vent, the one still hidden in the trunk of his car. It wasn't over, not yet. Harold spent the rest of the night planning his next move. He called Lorraine, explaining what had happened and urging her to meet him at a secure location to go over the remaining evidence. They agreed to proceed with contacting Jack, but Harold knew they were running out of time. The people behind the scandal were closing in, and the choices he made in the coming days would determine not only his fate but also the legacy of the truth he was fighting to expose. As Harold sat alone in his car, parked on a quiet street far from his ransacked home, he stared at the box in the passenger seat and thought about Margaret's words, "Are you willing to risk everything?" Harold didn't have an answer yet, but he knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back now. Harold sat nervously in a dimly lit coffee shop, the small box of evidence locked securely in his lap. The shop was nearly empty, its only patrons an elderly couple sharing quiet conversation in the corner, and a barista who paid little attention to Harold's anxious glances at the door. Lorraine had insisted on choosing the meeting spot, emphasizing the need for a public place with plenty of exits. It felt surreal, almost cinematic, to be here waiting for a journalist, a stranger who held the fragile promise of salvation in his hands. The tension was palpable, every tick of the clock amplifying Harold's doubts. Would Jack Reynolds show up? And if he did, could they trust him with something this explosive? The door swung open, and a tall middle-aged man with a weathered face entered. His coat was worn but clean, his hair neatly combed despite the streaks of gray that suggested years of battles fought and scars earned. Jack's sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Harold and Lorraine, who waved him over with a subtle nod. As he approached, Harold felt a mixture of hope and fear. This man had once been a force to be reckoned with in journalism, but that was years ago. Could he still be trusted to take on something this big? Jack sat down, his expression guarded but curious. "You said you have something connected to Claire Mallory," he began, his voice low and steady. "If this is some kind of wild goose chase, I don't have time for it." Harold wasted no time. He placed the box on the table, unlocking it with shaky hands, and began laying out its contents. Jack's skepticism faded as he examined the photographs, documents, and the tape recorder. His eyes widened, and he let out a low whistle. "This," he murmured, holding up one of the incriminating photos. "This is dynamite. If what you're showing me is real, it could blow the lid off everything." Jack's reaction was both reassuring and terrifying. Harold explained everything: the briefcase, the building's history, and the threats he'd been receiving. Lorraine added details about Claire's disappearance, her voice thick with emotion as she recounted her sister's bravery and ultimate sacrifice. Jack listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table. "This is bigger than I thought," he said finally. "If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Once this story gets out, they'll come after all of us." The next few days were a blur of activity. Jack worked tirelessly to verify the evidence, using his contacts to cross-check the names and events tied to the scandal. Harold and Lorraine stayed in hiding, constantly looking over their shoulders as they moved from one safe location to another. The pressure was immense, but Harold felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt like his life had meaning beyond the mundane routine of work and survival. He was doing something that mattered, something that would honor Claire's legacy and, perhaps, change the lives of countless others. But just as they prepared to go public, the unthinkable happened. Harold returned to their temporary hideout one evening to find the door ajar. Inside, the room was in shambles, papers scattered and the box of evidence missing. Lorraine was sitting on the floor, her face pale and her hands trembling. "They were here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They took everything." Harold's heart sank. He had known the risks, but the loss of the evidence felt like a fatal blow. Without it, they had nothing to prove their story, nothing to bring the truth to light. As despair threatened to overwhelm him, Jack called with unexpected news. "They didn't take everything," he said, his voice urgent. "I made copies of the key documents and recordings. It's not as strong as the originals, but it's enough to get the story out." The following morning, Jack's article went live. It was a bombshell expose, detailing the corruption, greed, and cover-ups tied to the Sterling firm and its powerful associates. The response was immediate and explosive. Social media erupted with outrage. News outlets picked up the story, and law enforcement agencies announced investigations. For a brief moment, Harold felt a flicker of hope. The truth was out, and the world was paying attention. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, Harold received a call from Peter Caldwell. His voice was calm but laced with menace. "You've made a big mistake," Peter said. "You think you've won, but you don't understand the game you're playing. Walk away now, and maybe we'll let you live." The call shook Harold to his core, but it also steeled his resolve. He realized that the fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Over the next weeks, Harold became a reluctant symbol of resilience, his story inspiring others to come forward with their own tales of corruption and injustice. The fallout was massive, with high-profile arrests and resignations, but it came at cost. Harold and Lorraine had to leave their old lives behind, living under new identities to stay safe from the powerful enemies they had made. In the end, Harold found solace in the knowledge that he had done the right thing, even if it had come at great personal sacrifice. One evening, as he sat on a quiet porch in an unfamiliar town, Margaret by his side, he reflected on everything that had happened. He thought of Claire, whose bravery had paved the way for justice, and of the lives that would be better because of her sacrifice. "We did it," he said softly, his voice heavy with both sorrow and pride. "We finally did it." Margaret reached for his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You did more than that," she replied. "You gave people hope. And sometimes that's the most important thing of all."